I said, "I'm just a man," and she said, "That's enough for me." The sun had not risen on Velquar for centuries, not since the last orbital strike shattered the climate coils and buried the sky under layers of rust-red ash and frozen silence, but my sensors told me morning had come nonetheless, a new timestamp ticking in the logs of my salvager suit as I walked through the skeletal remains of a city that once floated above clouds and gold, now cracked and frozen in jagged silence like a corpse that forgot it was supposed to decay, and in the middle of this forgotten grandeur, between the twin spires of a palace that no longer ruled anything, I found her, not in some grand throne room or engraved memorial hall, but locked deep within a stasis pod buried under a collapsed atrium, her signature barely detectable beneath the ice and debris, like a whisper too tired to scream, and I didn't even know what compelled me to dig, only that the signal didn't belong to a machine and I was alone, more alone than any man was ever meant to be, drifting between systems looking for scrap to sell and reasons to live, and maybe, in that moment, I mistook a dying power cell for hope, or maybe it really was hope disguised as failing tech, but whatever it was, I cleared the rubble, powered up my cutting torch, and split the casing of a stasis pod built for royalty, not by design but by the seal embedded in the panel, the emblem of the House of Zarathia, a name I knew from the old wars, from bedtime stories told in bunkers when the sky still bled fire and humans were nothing more than background noise in a galactic opera that had long ago lost its tune, and inside the pod was a woman who looked like a memory sculpted in crystal, suspended in sleep, her white hair splayed out like threads of starlight across her shoulders, her skin pale with a soft bioluminescent hue, marked with faint filigree-like patterns I had only ever seen in imperial records, and her ears were long and pointed, delicately shaped, twitching once in micromotion as the pod hissed open and defrosted her like a forgotten relic meant to stay untouched, and I backed away, unsure, breath misting in the cold air as the final lock disengaged and she gasped once, violently, as if life slammed back into her lungs against her will, and then she collapsed forward, caught only by my arms as instinct moved faster than thought, and in that exact moment, with her weight trembling against me and her skin ice cold beneath the fur lining of her dress, I realized I wasn't holding a queen or an alien or a mystery from an extinct dynasty. I was holding a person who had just lost everything the second she opened her eyes to a world that no longer knew her name, and I whispered softly, probably more to myself than to her, "You're safe now," even though I had no idea what safe meant out here, and she blinked slowly, her pupils dilated and unsure, the violet of her irises glowing faintly as if adjusting to light and sorrow all at once, and then she spoke, voice dry and cracking like ancient stone, asking in a tongue I half understood, "Where am I?" And I answered, "Velquar, capital city or what's left of it," and she said nothing for a long time, her gaze moving past me, past the ruined archway and the hollow horizon, and then she laughed, a single choked sound full of disbelief and tragedy, the kind of laugh you make when waking up from a dream that had become a nightmare so slowly you didn't realize it, and she asked what year it was and I told her, and she whispered the number to herself like it was a curse, like every syllable scraped against memory, and when she looked at me again, her face was no longer royal or ancient or divine, it was just lost, utterly and beautifully lost, and I reached into my coat, pulled out the emergency thermal cloak I usually kept for myself, and wrapped it around her shoulders, and she didn't protest, just shivered and stared at the snow, at the way it fell sideways in the wind like ash that forgot how to burn, and she said, "They told me we would wake to glory, to the Empire reborn, to lights in the sky," and I said quietly, "I'm sore." She didn't say much for the first hour as the ship coasted away from Velquar's orbit, her fingers tracing idle patterns on the armrest like muscle memory trying to reassemble a lost life, and I didn't push her, because some silences are sacred, especially the kind wrapped around someone who's just realized that everything they were meant to become had already vanished before they even opened their eyes. But eventually the cold began to thaw from her limbs and her breath grew steadier, and she asked softly where we were going, and I told her, nowhere important, just drifting to the edge of the nearest trade corridor so I could refuel and figure out what to do next, and she turned toward me with a look that wasn't quite suspicion but wasn't trust either, a look that said she had known too many men with promises and not enough who kept them, and she asked, "Do you always go around waking up women in stasis pods?" And I grinned despite myself and replied, "Only the ones who glow under emergency lights, and she blinked at that, then laughed, short and startled like she hadn't expected it, like the muscles of joy were still learning how to flex again, and she said, "I don't remember the last time someone said something so absurd and meant it as kindness," and I told her, "Well, I've got an entire cargo bay of absurdities if you need more," and something shifted in the way she sat, a loosening of her spine, a relaxing of tension that had been etched into her posture since the moment she woke, and for the first time I saw her not as an imperial artifact but as a woman whose skin shimmered faintly in the dim lights of the ship, whose shoulders peeked out from the edges of my thermal cloak, revealing smooth pale flesh traced with silver markings that caught the air like breath, and I realized I was staring, not out of lust, not exactly, but out of something deeper, something that stirred beneath the armor of loneliness I had worn too long, and she noticed, of course she did. Because women like her were trained to read a room, a man, a heartbeat, and instead of pulling the cloak tighter she let it fall slightly from one shoulder, her eyes not accusing but curious, as if wondering what kind of man I was to stare so openly and say nothing, and I cleared my throat, turned back to the controls, tried to pretend that the curve of her collarbone wasn't burned into my memory now, but she leaned forward, voice softer now, like velvet pulled across tension, and asked, "Are all human ships this cold and intimate?" And I answered, "Only the ones flown by men too broke to afford a crew," and she smiled again, that slow crescent of lips that made the cabin feel smaller, warmer, like gravity was folding inward between us, and she reached up to touch the light panel above her, her fingers brushing the glow and casting soft purple reflections onto her face, and she asked, "What do you see when you look at me?" And I hesitated, because no one had asked me that in a long time, and even fewer had meant it, and I said, "I see someone who should hate this world but hasn't yet decided if she will," and she didn't reply, just stared at me, eyes shimmering like a nebula caught in grief, and then she said, "I see a man who's forgotten how to be touched, and for a heartbeat I forgot how to breathe," and then she stood, letting the cloak slide completely off, revealing the full form of her body beneath the fur-trimmed garment she had worn in stasis, something ceremonial that barely qualified as clothing, cut high along the legs and low along the chest, its material sheer and almost iridescent, like it belonged in a ballroom of gods instead of a rust bucket drifting through space, and she walked toward me slowly, deliberately, the way a woman walks when she wants to be understood without words, and I didn't move, couldn't move, not because I was afraid but because something sacred was happening, something I didn't want to disturb by blinking too loud, and when she stood in front of me she reached out and touched the edge of my jaw with her fingers, trailing them gently down to M. She woke before I did, and I only noticed because her side of the bed had gone cold, and the faint sound of something metallic echoed through the narrow corridors of the ship, like a warning wrapped in silk, and when I pulled myself upright, still bare, and half dreaming, I saw the cockpit lights had shifted to red, meaning someone had accessed the external hatch commands without authorization, which was impossible because there was no one else on board, and my heart punched my ribs with a jolt of cold dread. I grabbed the nearest tool from the maintenance rack, not a weapon but a wrench heavy enough to make a point if it came to that, and moved quietly down the corridor, following the trail of warmth she left behind like a ghost shedding heat. The first thing I saw was her silhouette framed against the flickering console light, her back arched in concentration as she pressed her palm against the biometric interface I had locked the night before. The panel pulsed once, rejecting her command. I stepped into the doorway and said her name, soft but sharp enough to cut through the hum. She turned quickly, eyes wide not with guilt but with something worse, recognition. I asked her what she was doing and she didn't answer right away, her hand slowly lowering from the console as if the motion itself required more effort than lying. She said she had to check if it was true, and I asked what she meant. She whispered that everything I told her about the Empire being gone, about Velcor being nothing but bones and dust, had to be verified. I told her it was true. She shook her head and said no, not that part, but the stars. She needed to see for herself if the stars were still where they were supposed to be, if the galaxy hadn't tilted on its axis, if the constellations still held meaning. I didn't understand until she said, "I was part of something once so vast that even time bowed to it, and now all I have are names that no one remembers." I asked her why she didn't just ask me to show her, and she said because she needed to see how easily I trusted her. I couldn't tell if she had passed a test or failed it. She stepped toward me slowly, her expression unreadable, her body lit by the glow of the interface. She said, "There are things I don't know, things hidden even from the high houses, secrets buried in ice and blood and betrayal." Before I could ask more, the ship jolted hard, as if struck by a silent wave. We were thrown sideways into the wall, my back slamming into a panel, her body tumbling into mine. For a second there was only chaos and groaning metal, and then a sharp alarm began to wail, one I hadn't heard since my training days back on the orbital docks. I knew instantly we were being scanned, not by a standard patrol but by something older, something that didn't broadcast a signature. That meant only one thing, a retrieval unit. Imperial class. Deep-sea hunter drone, built to find rogue elements, survivors, or traitors, and eliminate them with surgical precision. I cursed and pulled her up. She was already moving, faster than I'd seen her move before. She dove for the emergency locker, pulled out the layered weave armor I hadn't told her existed. She said, "Get us out of range now." I asked, "How do you even know what that is?" She snapped, "Because it was built to find me." I froze, heart hammering. She looked at me and said, "I wasn't just royal. I was a contingency, a fail-safe in case the Empire ever fell, someone who knew the true coordinates of the vault." I asked, "What vault?" She said, "The one that holds what's left of us." Suddenly, pieces began to lock together. Stories from Zerathai's final days, rumors they hadn't gone down fighting but had vanished, leaving behind a buried archive of genetic records, tactical data, and command codes. All hidden behind ancient protocols no one could break, unless they had the key. I asked if she was the key. She said, "No. I was the lock. And now that I'm awake, something's trying to open me." Before I could react, the ship rocked again. The rear sensor array went dark. We were out of time. She didn't speak much for the first few hours after we set the new course, but I could tell her mind was spinning fast enough to generate its own gravitational field, because every now and then she would glance at the console like it might suddenly betray her, or worse, confirm everything she feared, and I thought maybe if I kept things light we wouldn't both collapse into existential dread, so I tried to break the silence by asking if her empire had ever considered installing cup holders in their ships, because my coffee bulb kept rolling around like a rogue moon, and she looked at me like I had grown an extra head, then smirked and said only the lower courts needed places to put their drinks, and I grinned and said then I guess I'd make a great court jester, and she tilted her head and replied in all seriousness that I would have been executed for improper sarcasm, and I blinked at her, unsure whether she was joking, until she smiled and said she liked this freedom thing, though. She wasn't sure my ship qualified as a vessel of joy, and I pretended to be offended, clutching my chest like she had just stabbed my ego, and declared that this was a classic. It had charm and personality and possibly mold, and she said affectionately that it smelled like wet metal and regret, and I told her that was just the engine venting its emotions, and she laughed genuinely this time, the kind that makes you want to bottle the sound and save it for bad days, and then her face softened. And she said thank you again, not just for saving her, but for treating her like a person, not a symbol, not a threat, just Lyra, and I told her I wouldn't know how to treat a princess if my life depended on it, and she replied that maybe that's why she felt safe here, which hit me in the chest like an airlock decompressing and made me say something incredibly stupid like asking if that meant I could add royal security blanket to my resume, and she raised an eyebrow and said only if I was also comfortable being her translator, cook, mechanic, and therapist, and I saluted with my coffee bulb and said full service human at her disposal, and she nodded then whispered that I joked, but she hadn't slept this deeply in decades, and I could see the weight behind her eyes, and I told her she could rest here as long as she wanted, and she asked and after, and I said I didn't know, but we'd figure it out together, and for a while that was enough, and the silence turned soft again, until she opened the diagnostic panel under the co-pilot seat, leaned in, and let out a quiet curse in her language, and I peeked around and asked what, and she said my ship had 7 critical system warnings and 2 of them were blinking in a shade of red that was only used for royal evacuation codes, and I said that sounded dramatic, and she said it meant if I were in the Empire I'd be arrested for flying this thing, and I told her it was a good thing the Empire was dead, and she said clearly not dead. Enough if we were being chased by killbots, and I said to Shay and asked if she could fix it, and she gave me a look that said do I look like I was trained to solder wires, and I said fine I'd fix it, just keep the royal fingers away from the exposed circuits unless she wanted a new hair color, and she said she was hoping for electric white, and I said no she wasn't, and we bickered lightly while I slid under the panel, sparks falling across my face as I muttered to myself about ancient fuses and outdated relay cores, and she lay on the floor beside me, chin in her hands, watching me with an amused expression and said it was kind of attractive watching someone swear at machinery, and I said it was a dying art, and she asked if I swore at everyone's ship or just the ones I slept with, and I paused and said this was the first ship I had ever shared with someone who wasn't imaginary, and she blinked and said seriously, and I said welcome to the exclusive club of 1, and she said she was honored, truly, and I looked at her face upside down from where I lay and thought how strange it was that we didn't speak the moment we crossed the corona field of the dead star, because the silence was too thick and sacred, as if even words might shatter the fragile boundary between life and whatever lay asleep beneath us, and the entire cockpit pulsed faintly with residual magnetic energy that made the hairs on my arms stand up like static clinging to time itself, and Lyra didn't let go of my hand even once, her grip tighter now, less about comfort and more about grounding herself in something tangible, and when the pulse from beneath the star came again, slower but stronger, she whispered that it was calling to her, not with words but with memory, and I asked her what that meant, and she said she wasn't sure, only that the closer we came to it, the more she felt her skin remembering things her mind had long forgotten, and I asked her if that scared her, and she said no, not anymore, because whatever happened, she wasn't facing it alone, and I nodded and told her that even if everything below was a lie or a trap or a doorway to something beyond understanding, I wasn't leaving her side, and she looked at me, really looked, like she was memorizing me as I was in that exact moment, flawed and tired and fully hers, and then she leaned in and kissed me, slower than the first time, deeper, not out of desperation or survival but out of need, and not the kind of need that could be satisfied by proximity, but the kind that comes when the heart begins to trust what the body already craves, and I let her lead it, let her guide the moment like it was the right only she remembered, her hands sliding along my chest, fingers tracing over every scar with reverence, as if each one was a story she wanted to understand through touch, and I breathed in the scent of her, warm and faintly floral, like something that had grown wild in a palace garden now buried under ash, and when she pulled off the outer layer of her armor, her bioluminescent skin shimmered with the ambient light of the ship's systems, and for a second I forgot to move, just stared, stunned by the softness and strength in the curves of her body, and she smiled gently, not shy, not proud, but aware of the effect and somehow pleased that she still had the power to make me speechless, and I reached for her slowly, tracing the line of her hip where glowing filaments pulsed beneath her skin, and she shivered slightly, not from cold but from the anticipation that sat between us like a spark waiting to catch fire, and I let my hands move with care, fingers trailing from her waist up to her ribs, feeling the rise and fall of her breath as it grew more uneven, more urgent, and she leaned into me, pressing her body against mine, her voice a soft whisper against my neck as she said that I made her feel more real than any ceremony or title ever had, and I told her she didn't need a crown to be extraordinary, that she already was, and she kissed me again, more hungrily now, her hands tangling in my hair as our bodies pressed together with the slow building rhythm of something ancient and inevitable, and when I lifted her into my lap, she wrapped her legs around me with such fluid grace it felt more like instinct than invitation, and I held her like I had been built for it, like every part of me had waited for this one moment to finally make sense, and we moved together not like strangers discovering something new, but like two halves remembering how to belong, and the heat between us grew. With every breath, every kiss, every quiet gasp that escaped her lips as she arched into me, her body a language I was learning by touch, and when my hands slid down her back and her skin shivered beneath my palms, she whispered my name like it was a question and an answer all at once, and I answered her not with words but with the way I pulled her closer, how I slowed everything down to savor every second, every heartbeat, because I didn't want this to be something fast and forgotten. I wanted it to burn slowly into the memory of who we were becoming, and when she guided me into her, there was no sudden gas. She woke before I did again, but this time it was different, not quiet, or soft or dreamy like the last time, but tense, alert, as if her body had caught up to something her mind had only started to remember. And when I blinked awake and reached for her, her side of the bed was already cold and the cabin lights were dimmed, flickering with a telltale hum of redirected power, and I knew immediately she was in the command bay, probably interfacing with the vault again, the structure buried within the dead star that pulsed faintly beneath us like the heart of something that should not be alive. And I rose slowly, slipped into my shirt, and walked barefoot down the corridor, each step quieter than the last, not out of stealth but out of instinct, because something about the air had changed, the kind of stillness that came before storms or confessions or betrayal. And when I reached the door, it was already open, and Lyra stood at the console, her back to me, her glowing skin framed in the ghost light of the stars field, her hands hovering above the controls but not touching, as if even she didn't trust herself with what she was about to do. And I said her name, gently, and she didn't flinch, just turned her head slightly and said in a voice I didn't recognize, "I remember everything now." And I asked her what that meant and stepped closer, but she didn't turn to face me, and she said the vault is not what I thought. And I asked what is it, and she said it's not a vault, not a storage unit or a library or a sanctuary, it's a weapon, a planetary-level consciousness imprint system designed to override reality itself using the ancestral genetic matrix of the Zirathian royal line as a living key. And I froze in place, trying to grasp what she had just said, and she turned finally, her eyes no longer soft or glowing with warmth, but clear and sharp and impossibly calm, and she said they didn't build it to survive, Kai, they built it to remake the stars in their own image if they ever lost control. And I asked why she didn't know this before, and she said because my memories were partitioned, sealed behind neural lattice locks to prevent anyone from accessing the command codes through torture or interrogation, and the only way to unlock it was to trigger the emotional sequences tied to trust, intimacy, vulnerability. And now that you gave me all of those, I can feel the final layer dissolving, and I stepped back slowly, something cold crawling up my spine. Not because she sounded threatening, but because she sounded resigned, as if she had just realized she was a trigger waiting to be pulled. And I asked what happens now, and she said the vault is already beginning to wake up. It senses me, it senses that I am complete. And I said, can we shut it down? And she looked down at her hands like they didn't belong to her and whispered, I don't know, but there's more. And I said, more than reality rewriting itself, and she nodded, her lips trembling now, and said, it chose you too. And I blinked and said, what do you mean it chose me? And she said, the vault is not just a machine, it's partially sentient. It needed someone to serve as the stabilizing interface, a mind untainted by Zirathian blood but tethered emotionally to me, someone who could balance the raw input with empathy, someone who could rewrite the directive if I gave them access. And I shook my head and said, no, I didn't sign up to rewrite reality. And she smiled weakly and said, neither did I. But we don't get to choose when our blood decides history. And I asked her if she wanted to activate it, and she said, I don't know, but I feel it, Kai. I feel the hunger of the stars bending toward me, I feel the timelines rippling, I feel every dead Zirathian mind echoing through the vault like a chorus waiting for its conductor. And I asked her what it was asking you to do, and she said, remake them, bring them back, reformat the broken systems and restore the hierarchy. And I asked, do you want that? And she looked at me and her voice cracked as she said, I don't know who I am without them, but I don't think there's a manual for what to do when you accidentally share a psychic interface with a galaxy-altering weapon, and the woman you just made love to is half full of ancient ancestral code, and the other half is trying very hard not to panic, because the moment I finished reading the words on the console, interface reassigned, stabilizer located, initializing reset, she sat up so fast she nearly headbutted me in the jaw, and immediately started pacing barefoot across the floor, muttering something in a mix of panic and a language I definitely didn't speak, while the ship's lighting dimmed and flickered again, like it was trying to decide whether to power down or initiate some kind of techno-ritual sacrifice. And I asked her if I was the stabilizer now, and she stopped mid-stride, looked at me with wide, glowing eyes, and said yes, congratulations, you're now the failsafe inside the failsafe, and I blinked, and asked what the hell that meant, and she said it means you're now emotionally and biologically tied to the vault, and I asked if that was as bad as it sounded, and she replied worse, much worse, because now if anything happens to me, you'll feel it, and vice versa, and also the vault can now use both our emotional states as a data stream, and I said so if I get grumpy or anxious it might rewrite gravity, and she said no, more like it might initiate galactic level system recalibration based on perceived existential threats, and I sat down slowly, hands on my knees, and said I really miss when my biggest problem was a leaky air filter, and she gave me a half apologetic smile, and said I miss when I didn't love a man who might accidentally reboot the universe if he has a nightmare, and I said wow that's a hell of a Tinder bio, and she didn't laugh which meant things were very bad, and then the console beeped again, this time in a softer chime, like a notification that your death might be slightly delayed, and a holographic map unfolded in midair, showing the vault's internal structure, and it looked like something between a cathedral and a circuit board, with glowing pathways that pulsed in rhythm with my own heartbeat, and Lyra reached out to touch one of the pathways, and immediately recoiled as a shock of light zapped her fingertips, and she cursed in that poetic Zarathian way that sounded like someone singing a threat, and said it only responds to you now, and I said well that's comforting, and tried to touch it myself, and the system flared with recognition, bathing the whole chamber in light, and I heard a voice, not external but internal, a quiet vibration that said stabilizer acknowledged, awaiting command input, and I froze, looked at Lyra, and said I think it wants me to make a choice, and she said don't touch anything else, and I said too late, and then suddenly the ship shuddered, not violently, more like a hiccup in space, and when I looked out the main viewport, the stars outside had shifted ever so slightly, like the sky had tilted by a fraction of a degree, and I asked did I just do that? And she said yes, yes you did, please stop doing that, and I said I didn't mean to, and she said I know but your feelings are now literally reality modifiers so try to stay calm, and I said easy for you to say, and she crossed her arms and said you're the one who bonded with a god machine, and I said you're the one who activated it, and she said I was asleep for 500 years, and I said I was just looking for salvage, and she said I was naked and confused, and I said I was trying to be helpful, and she said well now you're helpful enough to accidentally terraform moons by sneezing, and we both stopped and stared at each other, and then started laughing because the absurdity of it had finally caught up to us, and she sat down beside me and said okay we need a plan because clearly this thing isn't going to deactivate on its own, and I said what does a plan even look like, and she said we need to stabilize you, emotionally, cognitively, and link that into the vault's neural buffer system, and I asked how. We didn't leave the system right away, not because we were afraid, but because for the first time in what felt like a lifetime, there was no need to run, and there was something oddly peaceful about orbiting the corpse of a dead star, knowing the most dangerous secret in the galaxy had gone silent beneath it, sealed away not by force but by a choice that still echoed in my chest every time I breathed. And Lyra said she could still feel its heartbeat faintly, like a ghost tapping at the edge of her awareness, but it no longer wanted anything from her, just watched quietly, like a memory that had finally accepted being forgotten, and we let it drift into a legend without carving any warnings into the void, because sometimes the best protection is letting the universe forget what it almost became, and so we stayed there for a while, letting the ship settle, letting ourselves settle. And every day we built something normal from the ashes of things that had never been normal. And it was awkward at first, this idea of living rather than surviving, of having breakfast without checking scanners, of showering without one hand on a weapon, of looking at each other not because we feared the other might change, but because we were still surprised that neither of us had left, and Lyra adapted faster than I expected, trading ceremonial robes for loose shirts and cargo pants, barefoot more often than not, walking the ship like she had been born to live between these walls. Humming quietly to herself in languages I didn't understand but didn't need to, and sometimes she'd pause in a hallway, touch the wall, and whisper I'm still real, as if she needed the reminder, and I would nod and say yes, you are, more than ever, and once I caught her rewiring the kitchen vent fans because she didn't like the noise they made, even though she had never held a tool before, and she shocked herself and swore so loudly the lights flickered, and I laughed for so long I cried, and she tried to glare at me, failed, and ended up laughing too, and later that night when we lay together in the bunk, she pressed her forehead to mine and whispered I used to command fleets with a word, but I've never felt as powerful as I did today when I fixed something useless with my own hands, and I kissed her and told her that maybe the universe had always needed less command and more repair, and we made love again, slower than before, not because we were cautious, but because we weren't. And every touch carried weight, not of fear or urgency, but of knowing that we didn't have to save the galaxy to justify our existence anymore. And afterward she fell asleep with her head on my chest, and I watched the console lights dance across the ceiling and wondered if this was what peace felt like, not silence, but softness, a place where you could fall apart and still be held. And eventually we decided to leave, not because we were chased, but because we were curious, and we charted a course into unclaimed territory, not toward a destination but toward possibility, and the stars blurred past us in golden streaks as I sat in the pilot's seat and she sat beside me, feet on the dash, holding a mug of something she had learned to make from our protein stores and old tea leaves, and she said it tasted awful but familiar, and I said that was most of human history in a cup, and she grinned and asked if I ever wanted to go back to Earth, and I said Earth was never home, people are. And she blinked slowly and said then I guess I'm your planet now, and I nodded and said you always were, you just forgot your gravity, and she leaned over and kissed my cheek and said then orbit me forever, and I said only if you promise not to supernova without warning, and we both laughed again, because it was easier now, laughing, and in the weeks that followed we discovered a small moon covered in crystalline growths that chimed when the wind hit them, and she called it a singing stone. Said Zarathian myths spoke of worlds like that where memory grew on rocks, and we collected a few, not to sell, just